So now we are going to be talking about exposure. Exposure is very important if you actually want to see the video footage correctly from your camera. So the three important things to look at while you're exposing in camera is your shutter speed, your ISO, and your aperture. These things work together to make the exposure of your image. So what is aperture? Aperture is the hole in your lens, and it determines how much light is actually going into your camera sensor. So a good rule of thumb is that the smaller the number is, the more light going into the sensor. And the larger the aperture number is, the less light you will be seeing. So now ISO. ISO determines the sensitivity of your image sensor to the light outside of the camera. The higher the number on the sensitivity scale of your ISO, the more light sensitive your sensor actually is. And then you can use that more in darker situations, but you have to watch out for grain or noise in your footage. Try to manipulate the shutter speed and the aperture to get a good exposure, and try to stay away from getting too high on your ISO scale unless you really need it. Now, shutter speed. Shutter speed is the amount of time that each frame is exposed for in your video. So for example, a 1/60th shutter speed is 1/60th of a second exposure time for each frame in your video. So if you play around with aperture, ISO, and shutter speed, that is your exposure triangle for your video. So play around with this and make sure to not under or overexpose your footage. Like in example right now, this is underexposed footage, this is overexposed footage, and now this is perfectly exposed footage. And you want to play around with these. You don't want to be on the opposite side of each spectrum. You want to be right in the middle to make a perfect exposure each time you have video. So now take these three things, aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, and get the right exposure for your video.